It's a good song though. If we edit this into a YouTube video, we gotta have some jamming moments, you know what I mean? Like, you can't have just a PowerPoint presentation. I literally made a PowerPoint presentation about Fortnite Zero Build, boys. Like, come on. We gotta make this a little cooler. But how many streamers out there are making PowerPoints about Zero Build? You know? I would imagine probably just me. Josh of Josh's, how goes it? Man, I am jazzled right now. I'm having a great time. I hope you are as well. Today we're going to be going over a needs analysis framework and a few other methodologies by which we can aim to develop improvement. We're looking at Fortnite Zero Build specifically, and a lot of these concepts, though, are very broad and comprise very large portions of business consulting services. So this is a really good process for anyone who's, you know, in the business fields or anything else. You probably have heard of this before if you've ever had like any consultants, or I imagine if you've taken some business courses or even some statistical analysis courses, we'll be kind of touching on some stats and stuff a little bit. Very, very gently, boys. That's not my forte, so to speak. Anyway, let's just get on into it here. Did you guys expect to get suckered into a PowerPoint presentation? Because you're gonna right in now. Did that work? Let's see. Did that work? I think it did. Excellent. Cool. So this is our how-to needs analysis for Zero Build. Also, that's our logo. That's me. Right? Cool. We got transitions. Don't think we didn't put transitions into this. Listen, I had enough time to make transitions this week. All right. So a needs analysis is a strategic framework that we can use to improve at nearly anything. Specifically, today we're going to be looking at Fortnite Zero Build gameplay, and we've mentioned that a few times. But you could easily do this for any other game or a lot of other activities or even professions. So there's a lot of different steps or templates and kind of frameworks by which you may have heard of a needs analysis. Today we're going to be going over a 5-step needs analysis. And before we really get into what to do and all the fun steps, we do kind of have to understand maybe who would want to or need to perform a needs analysis and where this process kind of fits into your life and programs and stuff, right? So as we mentioned before, it's a process for improving performance, and we normally can find that if we have an experience that doesn't match our expectations, we call that an experience versus expectation gap. And in those gaps, we find the opportunity to improve so that we can get our experience to match our expectations. So, for example, here, you lost a fight, or I lost a fight. I thought I might win, right? So you ever been into a fight in a video game, and you're like, oh, I'm shooting this dude, and I think I'm going to win, and then suddenly they beat you, and you're like, weird, how did that happen? Okay, that's an experience versus expectation gap, right? Or maybe you tried to land. This is a very Fortnite-specific thing. I hear this all the time, and it was when I first started playing Zero Build, one of the things that really got me into and very excited about playing Fortnite was realizing there was a whole system and strategic kind of play style to understand how to land and where to land. It was a wonderful, like, the first decision in the game is so exciting for me. Maybe something like missing shots that you were like, oh, this is an easy shot. How'd I miss those, right? Any of those things can kind of count in the overarching theme of experience versus expectations and the gap kind of therein, right? Another place that you may find that you want to do a needs analysis is if you're seeking to improve, especially at high level activities. If something really matters to you, a needs analysis being a more detailed and granular look at areas to improve and develop and uncover root causes to issues is something that, because of its nature of how much energy you kind of have to put in, it is something that is very valuable when things are more valuable to you, right? So if you're maybe wanting to be the best player you can be or the best player in the world, a needs analysis is probably going to be a very important part of how you develop pertinent training programs, and we might call them intervention programs or intervention plans, right? Because we're going to say change a behavior or improve on a thing in order to get what you want, right? Does that make sense? We still all on the same page here, boys? Hope so. Okay, let's see if I can find where my mouse is right now. Oh, goodness. Okay, so there are 5 steps in our needs analysis today. We're going to go over gathering data, analyzing data, brainstorming our contributing factors, finding the root cause, and then developing an intervention plan or an action plan or any sort of plan to get us back to the beginning, where we kind of look back at our scope and our problem and say, hey, did we improve on it? Okay. That seems pretty straightforward, right? So before you go about gathering data, you kind of have to figure out what data to gather, right? So we're going to say that before we really can get started, we need to define what our goal is. And goals, well, you probably have heard like the SMART framework. We're going to say that there's really two very important parts within defining goals. We want goals that are measurable and specific. Okay, something that is easily measured and specific to either, a specific problem or restrained in scope in some ways. And one of the things that we kind of go through is the difference between I want to get good, right, which is not a very specific or measurable goal, versus the kind of experience versus expectation framework saying I frequently die off spawn and I don't want to, right? So there's our experience versus our expectation. So what we're going to say is our goal is to reduce deaths in the first two circles, right? Or off spawn, right? We think of off spawn as being where you land and probably most of that early game area until you leave, right? So we can say within the first two circles, we don't want to die, or at least we want to die less often, okay? Does that make sense? That's going to be kind of our example guy. We're going to be going through Mr. I don't know. You guys want to make a name up for our hypothetical human here? You can use mine. Okay. All right. So we're going to say our boy is Harpy. Okay. Harpy here doesn't want to die off spawn and is frequently dying off spawn. So we're going to reduce his deaths. Okay. This Harpy's going to reduce his deaths. Oh my goodness. All right. That was the first one we got. That's fine. Okay. Going on here. Step 1, gathering evidence or data, okay? There's going to be so much data that we could gather, hypothetically, regarding Harpy's deaths off spawn, right? One of the things that we want to do is make sure that the data that we are gathering is relevant, right? Because there is, we'll say easily infinite data that we could gather. We do kind of try to, just as we do restrain the scope of the goal, we want to restrain the scope of the data that we get. And so for this specific example, we're going to focus on game replays, right? So we would go through and we would look at the replay files and say, hey, is there any sort of data that we can pull out of the replays themselves that is going to help us to understand why we're dying off spawn so frequently, okay? Now, within the replays we could look at, I'm going to really suggest to you guys, try to constrain your needs analysis if you're doing it for Fortnite, especially a game like Fortnite. Constrain it to the most recent patch or the most recent significant patch, right? So we talked earlier about how the game just evolved frequently. If you're a pubs player, you'll have a different loot pool than a ranked player. And if you are thinking about things from a ranked perspective, you shouldn't look at pubs games that much in the context of making your ranked games better, because there's a lot of extra noise in that data from the extra items and other things and the way that the game performs, bots, etc., that really make it less relevant than, say, gathering ranked data. Or if you're a pubs player specifically, we want pubs stuff, right? Because that's the framework, that's the relevancy. So we try to stay constrained in scope, both in time, so within the relevant patch, and then also the relevant kind of game mode and other ways, right? So, for example, if you're a pubs player and you were playing recently, oh shit! Thank you for the follow. Who was that? I can't see it. That was Major Magic. Thank you for the follow. So, yeah, thank you for being here. We're going over a needs analysis for Fortnite Zero Build. I hope you have a good time. We just started. We're literally on step 1, so you're at the perfect time to get here. So we're going over gathering data. We've talked about we want to make sure that the data is relevant. We're constraining it to replays, and we're constraining it to the most recent patch, okay? So we can say that we died off spawn, Harpy here, died off of spawn 8 times out of 20 games that we analyzed, okay? What killed us, we kind of fill this out. This is some of the data that we would grab for off spawn deaths. Say what killed us: shotties 3 times, ARs once, SMGs 3 times, and even a pistol, okay? games we didn't die off spawn was 12. So we're actually not dying all the time, but it doesn't kind of matter that we're not dying every game. But we do want to make sure that we're paying attention to both of them to kind of see if there's anything that may be relevant later. And one of the things that we would want to look at as far as relevancy in games we didn't die off spawn, even if we're worried about dying off spawn, is how many times were we contested and what happened in those games, right? So if you're going around and you're just smashing everybody in 12 games, people are landing on top, it's a very hot POI, you're saying you were contested in 20 out of 20 matches, that would be a little different than not being contested in so many games. So in this case, we have didn't die off spawn 12 times. Of those, we were contested 4 times, which means we were involved or around players 4 out of the 12 games. It means we weren't contested 8 of those times out of the 20. So almost 50% of the time, we're not even contested at this POI, which means it's not that hot, right? We could probably assume that this isn't the, you're not landing at the raft, right? Or Doom's area. That would be, this would be more of like a classy courts. If again, and we're also going to take one step back and just make sure that we were restraining our data in this hypothetical to landing at the same spot every game. So just understand that may not always be the same for you. And so the relevancy of the data or the way that you may want to set up gathering data, you can, do things to minimize variables by, say, landing at the same spot or other choices. But in our hypothetical example for Heartbeat here, it was classy courts 20 times in a row. Okay. Major Magic with the howdy. That's a good emote, dude. That's a really good emote. I love that. Okay, let's see. Going on. We're going to analyze our data, right? So we get data, we analyze the data. And let's look at this a little more specifically. Within the things that killed us, we can say shoddy, AR, SMG, pistol. We can say that the games that we were contested was 4. Of those games that we were contested, we had some outcomes that weren't the same. We killed our opponents in 3 of the games out of the 4 we were contested, and in 1 game we didn't. So even there, we could say, if we're looking at the data, why didn't we kill them in that one? What did we kill them with in here? Stuff like that. Right? And we can start getting a case as we start going further into our root cause analysis that will come down the pipeline later. We can start using this data and it'll be like the thing we rely on. So one thing we want to do before we get into analyzing it too deeply within the framework of a root cause analysis, right? Kind of figure out what is the singular, most consistent thing that is causing our deaths. We want to make sure that we're not getting distracted by data that can be noisy, or what we'll call as the next step is brainstorming contributing factors, right? So contributing factors can be a variety of stuff. Let's see, excuse me. Things like the bus route and the relative position of the drop can change the kind of RNG of a location in a variety of ways. Imagine if the bus route frequently was dropping always over the same spot, or always where it was a very long 2,000 meter glide from the end of the bus route. That could change. That could be a contributing factor. And if we don't kind of manage for that, it could kind of change some of the data landing at different spots, as we mentioned before. Queue type, as we kind of pulled in, squads versus solos, ranks, builds versus zero builds, even the region that you're playing in, the kind of timing. If you've heard people say, sometimes when they want to play really well, they'll try to get into a region that is like at 5 a.m. And so I've heard a lot of people say, oh, I play rank in the Middle Eastern servers because it's easier than EU West, or it's easier than NA Central, or something like that, right? So there's a lot of different small things that could contribute to why the data kind of pulls the way it does. And if you don't kind of pay attention to those things, you may miss out on trends or kind of misattribute things. Again, we can also talk about server choice, latency, how much ping you have, the loot RNG, as we mentioned before, which boxes spawn and which ones don't, and then also skill-based matchmaking. A match for one of the top players in the world is not going to look or play out like in a tournament the same way as a pubs match for someone who got their very first crown. Those would be very different pools of players, and those contributing factors are going to play into different things. And one of the things that we do all this for is to try to make sure that we don't get stuck in outcome-oriented exclusive thought processes, especially when we're looking at lower skill-based matchmaking. There's a lot more mistakes that go unpunished. And so sometimes you can do the wrong thing in a game from a strategic framework, but not be punished for it, and actually turns out to be the right answer, right? And sometimes even you can do the right thing and lose and be like, oh no, maybe I shouldn't do said right thing. And then by misattributing the kind of why, or only looking at the result, you could end up creating bad action plans, right? So we want to make sure that we're taking some time to kind of think about what sort of factors might be contributing to the data that we've gathered outside of the data itself, right? Things that we don't necessarily account for or could miss accounting for, right? Moving on from that, we're going to actually get into finding the root cause, okay? So we can call that kind of a root cause analysis, or a lot of different things. I mean, heck, I technically have a certification in just root cause analysis by itself for business, right? So there's a lot of different tools and ways that you can go about doing root cause analysis or understanding how to take your data apart. And while it's going to be a little outside the scope of right now, what we will say is that we always want to make sure that whatever we end up pulling on, whatever thread we pull on, is going to be data supported. And it's something that should be observable within trends and patterns, right? If we're looking at specifically data sets as small as 20 games, something to be aware of is that a lot of the statistical significance that you would pull if you're doing data science will be a lot less relevant. So if you've heard of a p-value when doing statistical analysis and stuff, if the p-value isn't strong, then like your data isn't very much supporting your cause, or isn't very powerful in that way. So we can think of data sets in the thousands or millions as being very good and very strong, and it very much more likely to give us some sort of significance. But when we're looking at individuals and kind of like the sports performance side of things, we have to understand that some of the gold standards of data are going to be a little different than they would at very large scale. So if you have some background in numbers, you'll understand what I'm talking about. But if you don't, just understand that percentages can get a little wonky when you're only looking at 3 or 4 interactions or something like that, right? So don't get too excited by that. So one thing that we could do in our hypothetical here, if we're looking at harpies not wanting to die off spawn as frequently, hypothetical, right? We could look at something like our shots taken versus shots received. We can look at our accuracy, our opponent's accuracy, even potentially. That'd be a really granular thing to do. But you could do it technically. You could say, how many shots did they shoot at me? How many shots did they shoot at them? And I think that just even in that number and getting a ratio out of that, you can get an idea of who had more pressure in the fight. And obviously, there is a subjective amount of ability to just perceive what the issues may be by watching the gameplay. If you're kind of well-versed in the game or the fundamentals therein, you will be able to see some of this. But again, it should be easy to kind of support this within our data. So again, accuracy, shots taken versus received. And even within the shots taken and accuracy, we can look at something as small as which shots do we miss the most? Is there a trend there? Are we always missing our first shot? Or are we hitting our first shot and we're missing follow-up shots, right? There's a lot of different things that could happen within the same kind of data. So it's very often the case that as you're working on a root cause analysis, you may go back to step 2 and go back to your data and say, hey, I'm kind of interested in this. I noticed that we're in fights, in our hypothetical here, we're in fights, and a lot of our fights are actually pretty close. It seems like when I was watching the gameplay, we're hitting shots to start the fight, and our peaks are looking good. We're, fundamentally taking right shoulders. We're not taking super disadvantaged fights. It seems like our opponent and I kind of know where each other are. There's not like an information discrepancy, and there's no like major tempo difference between the two of them, like one person having super good loot and one person not. It's pretty even fights, right? And if we're seeing that in these even fights that we're starting our fight strong, then we might say, hey, the intervention we want to come up with later might be different. than if we're not doing such a thing, right? So when we start looking at that, we go, okay, let's pull on the data a little bit and let's see if there is anything. And so in this case, we're saying that we're hitting the first shots. So that's going to change how we look at our specific root cause, right? And in this case, we're saying that our root cause is based around a tracking issue, right? So we could say mouse control or stick control or crosshair placement, whatever, but we're getting our flicks okay. We're getting in good position. We're getting that first shot, but we need to improve tracking. Specifically, since a lot of these fights, we looked at which items killed us, and we could say that those items were shotgun, SMG, and pistol. Very few AR deaths, means we're not dying at mid to long range. Obviously, we could look at the ARs and say, were they used as a spray weapon after a shotgun, or were they used in close range? We can even parse the data down to how far apart were the opponents during the engagements and get, all sorts of cool numbers and heat maps of where our damage is dealt in distance, blah, 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 right? But regardless, we're going to say, for our hypothetical here, that we're missing a lot of the short and mid-range tracking shots. We're hitting our first shot, the fight gets a little chaotic, we miss our shots, and so we need to improve tracking. So if you guys were working with somebody like this, or you're thinking about it yourself, and you're like, oh man, that kind of sounds like me, what do you guys think you may want to do as far as developing a specific intervention or a training strategy for improving your tracking, right? We may say that we could do smooth tracking situations. You can do situational drills. You can get a friend and have them, like walk up and down, just have him shoot at you a little bit. You can also do something that we worked on last week a little bit, and we'll touch on it again over time, is predictive observation. So it's kind of an idea of predicting where your opponent's moving, like kind of looking at what way are they facing, right? So if they're always facing this direction, most players are moving forward most of the time, right? If they're looking this way, you probably have an idea that they're going to move that direction, right? There's not a lot of players who are running away from you backwards and spraying. Most players kind of move forward in a kind of like circular pattern, right? So we'd want to start working on some ways to develop our observational skills. But if you guys can think of other things, it'd be awesome. Larson, which shots do we miss most? I'm pretty sure that would be the ones we don't take. I hear that's 100% miss rate. Oh my God, Larson. Oh my goodness. I'm so glad you're here. Also, what a good joke. That was great. You're so good at those. Okay. So there's a lot of different things we could do to develop an intervention plan. And generally what we're going to do once we get to that intervention plan, we're going to put it into action. And then we're going to take it all the way back to the beginning, and we can kind of just run the same simulation again. We could say, hey, we did our intervention plan. Then we did 20 more games dropping at the same spot. And then we did all of the data analysis. And we can see, did things change, right? And this is kind of the power of doing these kind of performance improvement, kind of continuous process strategies, is that it gives you an opportunity to improve over time and to continue to investigate the same problem and all of the subsequent processes that you've implemented towards working to the same thing. It may be that in the first weeks, it's, hey, every week, man, I'm just really struggling on tracking. You do a bunch of tracking work, suddenly your tracking improves, and now maybe you move up in the skill-based matchmaking. You start playing people that are a little stronger. Suddenly, hey, I'm really struggling. We notice we're struggling with losing AR tags. We start realizing our mid-range fighting is a little weaker than the players we're playing against. And then we say, why is that? Well, maybe they have better tempo. Maybe they're landing at the position faster. Maybe they're getting an information advantage. There's a lot of things that could change after you put in the intervention. So we talk about intended consequences, which is we want to die off spawn less. But the unintended consequences are something as well that are neat, kind of the beneficiary of the continuous process improvement system here, is that we can say, hey, the unintended consequences, what's happening out of this? Oh, we're going up in skill base. That might be unintended. Our opponents are getting harder and how we're dying to different things, or we have to develop different skills. We're less consistent at being the first person to land on the map, or any number of things could happen. And so keeping these kind of process approaches available as a tool, again, for people who are highly motivated in any field, whether it's, again, we talked about business, video games, or anything else, anywhere where you want to have increased performance. You can do this. right? But we did also mention this is a very granular and labor intensive approach. Maybe you don't have time to gather the data and go through it and parse it, make a spreadsheet, or maybe you just don't want to. Maybe the game to you is very casual. So what can you do if you are a more casual player and you don't want to do this? This is crazy. This is like, I'm back at work or school. What am I doing here? Why am I in this stream, right? Well, here's some alternatives. Okay. One, you can get a coach. Hey, look at that. I'm here. I'm a coach. I coach this game, and I can shortcut a lot of the difficulties that come with it, with learning, and sometimes the just general having an outside perspective is something that's very powerful, especially if you're looking to improve. Sometimes it's very easy to overlook things just by the closeness that you may feel from being involved. Or perhaps maybe you just need to get started with something simple, like a small routine. Maybe you could get on 5 minutes before you play with your squad. You and the boys are going to get on, and you say, hey, I'm just going to hit my this little 10-minute warm-up that we talked about. I'm just going to do 10 minutes. We're going to warm up, and then I'm going to play with my friends. Awesome, right? You can just as well make kind of continual improvement through small steps and goals as you can through these more elaborate and labor-intensive needs analysis or external coaching as a supplement, right? There's a lot of different ways we could do it, but at the end of the day, we're playing games to have fun, right? We're playing games to have fun, and for me and a lot of the people in this community, we find fun also within improvement. I've never heard a person who said, man, I got better at the game. I'm so disappointed in myself. You know what I mean? When was the last time you're like, man, I'm really getting good at this shit? Ah, damn it. You know, it doesn't really work together, right? It's almost always, man, I'm getting better. I'm smashing people today, dude. I feel invincible. That's great. And so that's one of the reasons that I put this kind of stream on every week is I'd like to have people be able to find more joy in what they do, and also feel kind of that empowered feeling and confidence that comes with being better and getting better and feeling that process. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this cute little 10 slide survey, not survey, what am I saying? 10 slide presentation